JFK wasn't just a president. He and his family symbolized all that America aspired to. But behind his robust public image was a man whose life had not only been touched by tragedy, but defined by it.
If the public knew how many medical problems he had, I think it would have destroyed his presidential ambitions.
President Kennedy's mother, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, kept meticulous records regarding each of her 9 children. That's how we know young JFK suffered from a long list of illnesses, including whooping cough, measles, and chickenpox. Turns out, one almost killed him.
When Jack is 2 years old, he contracts scarlet fever, and he is basically sick for the rest of his life.
The symptoms of scarlet fever include an all-over rash, body aches, fever, swollen glands, vomiting, and difficulty swallowing, and it can cause permanent health problems. Kennedy's case was so severe that before he was hospitalized, he was given last rites. He spent 12 weeks in the hospital and then in isolation before he recovered, but only from the scarlet fever. For the rest of his life, Kennedy would be plagued with poor health. It's believed that he had constant trouble with digestion, often cited as irritable bowel syndrome. There were also chronic urinary tract infections, ulcers, and prostatitis, which is a painful swelling of the prostate gland. And when he was a young adult, JFK was forced to take time off from school due to an unknown illness, sometimes said to be hepatitis. On top of all those ailments, he began to have severe back pain during college. When World War II broke out, Kennedy enlisted. He was sent to the Pacific, where he was given command of PT-109, a patrol torpedo boat whose mission was to harass Japanese supply ships. It was wildly dangerous, and on a pitch-black night in August 1943, Kennedy's boat was idling out in open water when tragedy struck.
A Japanese destroyer emerged out of the darkness, racing at 40 knots, and split his boat in half.
2 crewmen were never seen again, several others were severely injured, and the survivors were left stranded with the burning wreck and the nearest land more than 3 miles away. Kennedy swam for 3 hours, gathering his surviving men together onto the wreckage. The following day, that wreckage began to sink.
They're drifting, holding on to the hull and drifting in the water when he sees a group of islands about 3 miles off.
Kennedy swam the 3 miles to shore, towing a fellow crewman he'd lashed to a piece of debris. In 1963, PT-109, a movie version of What Happened Next with Cliff Robertson as JFK, was released. Once on land, with 2 of his men dead and serious injuries of his own, Kennedy realized there wasn't much food, water, or shelter from the sun where they were. He's said to have told his crew, "There's nothing in the book about a situation like this. A lot of you men have families and some of you have children. What do you want to do? I have nothing to lose." Kennedy then took off swimming to find help, but found no friendly ships or better accommodations in the area. He returned to the men, but after 4 long days with no sign of rescue, he led them back into the water once again. This time, they found a larger island with coconut trees that offered food, shelter, and water. But JFK's ordeal wasn't over. He and another crewman swam for miles until they landed on the occupied island of Nauru. Unwilling to risk being spotted by the Japanese, he had the natives deliver a message written on a piece of coconut shell to American forces and swam back to his men. The gambit worked. 1 week after the attack, the survivors of PT-109 were rescued and returned to a U.S. base. But the physical ordeal had taken a toll on Kennedy.
His weight was down to around 120. His back was so bad, he needed a brace and a cane to walk.
The coconut with the message that saved the crew's lives sat on JFK's desk in the Oval Office. The Kennedys might be well-stocked with politicians, but JFK had no political aspirations, at least not at first. He wanted to be a teacher or journalist, and in 1945, he even spent some time covering the end of the war for Hearst newspapers. It was his older brother Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr., who was generally considered the more serious and responsible one, who their father often claimed was going to be president.
Unlike Joe, Jack was not dutiful. He had a little bit of a rebellious streak.
Joe Jr. and John were, by all accounts, incredibly close growing up. After several years as a successful pilot serving with the British Naval Command, Joe volunteered for Operation Aphrodite even though he had flown more than enough successful missions to earn his way home. The operation was essentially an experimental program exploring the potential of remotely piloted drones.
The plane would be set on remote and it would attack these super guns that were being put in place by Hitler.
Joe Jr., along with another pilot, Wilford J. Willey, was flying one of these crafts when it exploded. John was in the hospital when he heard the terrible news. He reportedly said, "Now the burden falls on me." In Joe Jr.'s absence, their father's political ambitions now transferred to JFK, whose political career officially began when he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1946. One of Kennedy's very personal commitments as president was to improve the treatment to people with disabilities, which had remained brutal and backward throughout American history. At the time he took office in 1960, institutions were almost universally overcrowded, along with a host of other problems. But almost immediately after being elected, Kennedy made it clear that one of his priorities was changing that. He announced a host of new directives in February of 1963 with overwhelming support from his sister Eunice. Their dedication came from a deeply personal place. When their sister Rosemary was born, there were complications. Those who were there at the time say the midwife insisted that Rose Kennedy wait for a doctor to arrive to give birth. She managed to obey for 2 excruciating hours, but her efforts resulted in baby Rosemary being deprived of oxygen. Rosemary was diagnosed with behavioral problems and learning disabilities at a young age, although she was charismatic and fun. She charmed everyone she met, but was shuffled from private school to private school due to her behavioral problems. She thrived in England, but was sent back to the US at the beginning of the war.
Unfortunately, to the Kennedy family, who had big political ambitions, they thought of her essentially as an embarrassment.
Finally fed up with Rosemary's problems, Joe Kennedy unilaterally decided to go with the new rage and mental health treatment and have her lobotomized. The procedure left her mostly paralyzed and unable to talk. She lived for 64 more years in an institution where visitors were strictly prohibited, dying in 2005. The image that John F. Kennedy projected was one of robust physical health. He was known for encouraging Americans to exercise. He overhauled federal guidelines for phys ed schools and oversaw the development of youth health programs.
I think that mental and physical health, mental and physical vigor go hand in hand.
But Kennedy's image was just that, a facade concealing the truth that he lived with chronic pain and was bedridden for much of his life. In fact, Kennedy spent so much time with books that he learned to read 4 times faster than the average person. Kennedy's health issues are enough to fill a book, starting with a football-related back injury that led to 4 spinal surgeries, none of which were considered successful. These came with a long list of complications, including abscesses, bone infections, and later, osteoporosis and several fractured vertebrae. The pain was so bad at times that he was unable to perform everyday tasks. And for the rest of his life, he was on a laundry list of meds, including antispasmatics, antibiotics, barbiturates, opiates, and localized anesthetic injections.
The joke always was that if a mosquito bit Jack, the mosquito would get sick.
And then there was Addison's disease. Addison's disease is a potentially life-threatening condition that develops when the adrenal glands struggle to produce the hormones cortisol and aldosterone. There are a slew of symptoms, including chronic stomach pain, cramps, fatigue, low blood pressure, low blood sugar, and changes in appearance.
He was so ill that his father had put cortisone treatments in safe deposit boxes around the country if he ever needed them because of his Addison's disease.
Kennedy began showing signs of the disease after World War II and was among the first to receive hormone replacement and cortisone injections to combat his condition. It's easy to look at a family like the Kennedys and assume everything was perfect, but if we pull back the curtain and take an honest look, we can't help but respect the strength of First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy. That fateful trip to Dallas in November of 1963 was part of the First Lady's reemergence into the public eye after spending several months away from the spotlight. In August, she gave birth to a premature baby boy, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, who died at 2 days old. Patrick was the 3rd child the Kennedys lost. In 1955, Jackie's first pregnancy ended with a miscarriage, and she was told that any future pregnancies would be high risk. The doctors were right. The following year, she gave birth to a stillborn daughter. Then, in 1957, baby Caroline was born healthy. John Jr. was born in 1960, but there were complications at the birth. John's life was saved by a quick-thinking pediatric resident. When news leaked that Jackie had gone into premature labor in 1963, the headlines were filled with confidence that things would go well and there would soon be another perfect baby in Camelot. Jackie was still in the hospital when baby Patrick was buried, and still in mourning when the president invited her to accompany him on what should have been a routine trip to Texas. Lots of details have come out about the assassination of John F. Kennedy since that shocking November day, and some of those things were buried in classified and heavily redacted documents that have been released piecemeal over the decades, with the latest, largest batch coming out in March 2025. One revealing memo came to light in a 2017 document dump. It was written by the CIA to the FBI and contained something incredibly weird. About 25 minutes before Kennedy was shot, an anonymous telephone call was made to the senior reporter of the Cambridge News in the UK. According to then CIA Deputy Director James Angleton, the caller said only that the Cambridge News reporter should call the American Embassy in London for some big news and then hung up. Was it coincidence, or did somebody know what was about to happen? The call was reported to MI5. Although it was noted in the memo that it was something to investigate, nothing seems to have come from it. It's often said that those who were alive in 1963 remember where they were when John F. Kennedy was shot, and over the years, many who were there on that Dallas street have shared their stories about what it was like to witness the assassination firsthand. Teenagers skipped school to see the president, families gathered to watch the motorcade go by, and some took videos and snapped photos, with no idea they would become some of the most famous in American history. The details are well known. Kennedy was on the brink of announcing that he'd be running for a second term when he embarked on a 9-state speaking tour. Texas was, at the time, not a lock for the president, so he headed down there with the goal of doing what he did best, talking to the people. He and Jackie got into a car with Governor John Connally and his wife. They were driving through Dallas when several shots were fired over Dealey Plaza at around 12:30 p.m. The governor was wounded. Kennedy was declared dead at 1 p.m., and within hours, America had a new president. America learned the tragic news from one of the country's most trusted news anchors, CBS's Walter Cronkite, who was visibly shaken when he said the words, "From Dallas, Texas, The Flash, apparently official. President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Time, some 38 minutes ago." President Kennedy's funeral was historic, and Americans mourned not only in the Capitol but nationwide. One of the most heartbreaking images from that day is a photo of John Jr. standing beside his mother, uncle, and sister, raising a hand in a salute to his father's casket as it passed by. Photographer Dan Farrell described the scene to Town and Country, saying, "It was the saddest thing I'd ever seen in my whole life. I knew it was a good picture. I'm just glad my emotions didn't take over when I was trying to take the picture." John had been practicing his salute in preparation for an upcoming ceremony at Arlington. The day he used it to salute his fallen father's casket also happened to be his 3rd birthday. Later that afternoon, there was a small birthday party for John Jr. at the White House. Years later, one of John Jr.'s close friends, Sasha Chermayeff, told People how the two of them were walking with their 3-year-old son in the East Village one day when she remarked that Kennedy was the same age when he lost his father. John Jr. replied, "You never get over it."
Was that beautiful little child who stood for something so hopeful in the face of such tragedy.
John Jr. also died tragically young. He was 38 years old when he was killed in a 1999 plane crash along with his wife and sister-in-law. It's human nature to look back and wonder if things really needed to play out the way they did, and it turns out that JFK's lifelong struggle with back pain may have actually contributed to his death. According to a few sources, including Dr. Kenneth Salyer, who was a resident at Parkland Hospital in Dallas when the injured Kennedy was brought in, he saw the president's injuries firsthand, as well as the steel-reinforced back brace he was wearing when he was hit. There was some distance between where Kennedy's car was when the first and second shots were fired, and Salyer noted that after the first shot, the injured Connally dropped to the floor of the car, but Kennedy didn't have the flexibility to duck, and the second shot tore through his skull. If he'd been pushed to the floor, even by the momentum of that first shot, there's a chance things might have ended differently. Others who were there that day, including Senator Ralph Yarborough and doctors Charles James Carrico and Malcolm Oliver Perry, have also said that that first bullet didn't hit any of Kennedy's bones or arteries, causing any life-threatening injuries. They, too, blame the brace for forcing him to remain upright, making him a clear target for the second fatal shot. JFK is widely known as a president who was a driving force in the shaping of the country throughout the 1960s. He's often mentioned alongside things like the space program and the civil rights movement, although there's considerable debate about Kennedy's early commitment to civil rights. While it's true that he laid the groundwork for a lot of programs, he didn't live to see many of them come to fruition. For example, Kennedy championed Medicare, but it was also officially signed into law by LBJ. He was also outspoken on issues of increasing funding for schools, expanding special education programs, and desegregation. But it was Johnson who signed the Higher Education Facilities Act in December of 1963. And the big one, perhaps, is the space race. Kennedy's 1961 speech on the space program was one of his most famous speeches and arguably a defining point of his career.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Even though NASA and the Apollo program met the challenge he threw down, Kennedy, of course, didn't live to see it.
Sometimes conspiracy theories turn out to be true.
It's no secret that there are a ton of conspiracy theories out there about what really led to the death of President Kennedy. And given the number of strange things about the assassination, it's not surprising.
So what really happened that day? Let's just for a moment speculate, shall we?
Although there wasn't much new information to be found in the long-awaited 2025 release of the remaining assassination files, there were a few minor revelations buried there. Documents suggesting Kennedy wasn't a fan of the CIA added fuel to some conspiracy theories.
We had no threats, no information that would lead us to believe that it was going to be a major problem.
There's another document in the 2025 release that seems to suggest there was advance warning of the assassination. It came from Sergei Chornino in the form of a handwritten letter to the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. The 1978 letter claimed that he'd told British authorities back in July of 1963 that he'd heard a man named Lee Harvey Oswald was planning on killing Kennedy. Further letters claim that Chornow had gone to Washington, spoke with authorities at the Department of State, and said that the assassination was planned for Dallas. He also claimed that government officials had harassed him in an attempt to keep him quiet, and the only other document in the file is a promise to provide legal representation from the Legal Center for the Disabled. So the question is, did someone know something that could have stopped it?
Did you kill the president?
Most people have probably heard the theory that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't act alone. It seems as though an autopsy report would have been enough to clear up those questions, but as early as 1966, the news broke that there were massive problems with President Kennedy's autopsy.
I know what it is to kill someone. You don't bounce and come this way. When you bounce and come this way, you got hit in the front.
It turned out that the doctors had skipped basic steps like weighing the late president's organs. And there were other issues. The person who drew and labeled the diagrams that were used in official testimony never saw actual photos of Kennedy's body. And one of the doctors admitted that he'd been so horrified by the original blood-stained autopsy report that he'd burned them.
This part of the head was gone. There was no scalp there.
The autopsy photos on file are largely illegible, and the paper doesn't match other photos processed by the White House at the same time. And on top of all that, the person who processed those photos claimed they were different from the ones that ultimately made it into the official file.
The two pictures that I've seen that you showed me that are supposedly from the archives are not what I saw that night.
Other forensics experts have called out the autopsy as flawed. Werner Spitz, one of the world's leading forensic pathologists, was asked to consult on the Kennedy case in 1975. He told USA Today, "There were so many sources of error, they botched the autopsy. They had absolutely no experience in forensic pathology. That seems an odd choice when dealing with the assassination of a sitting president."
Please disperse! Nothing to see here!
Will the world have had more answers with an autopsy done today? There have been plenty of technical advancements, sure, but in this case, unqualified people seem to have done a substandard job. The big question is why?
He died of a gunshot wound in the brain.
Buckle up, because things are about to get weird. When we say goodbye to our loved ones, we count on a lot of people, from doctors and coroners to undertakers and morgue workers, to do things correctly and respectfully. And if our loved one is the President of the United States, that would be a given, right? Not with Kennedy, apparently.
Certain people in our government tampered with critical evidence in order to make sure the American people would not know the truth about who murdered the president.
In 1972, just 9 years after the assassination, Coroner Cyril H. Wecht, a pioneer of forensic pathology and a champion of families dealing with suspicious deaths, examined the Kennedy autopsy reports and physical evidence. He found that not only were some slides and samples missing, but Kennedy's entire brain had disappeared.
The single bullet theory is sheer, absolute, unadulterated nonsense.
At the time of his 1972 review, Wecht stated definitively that no one would ever know the truth about the Kennedy assassination without the late president's brain. It was reported that Kennedy's personal secretary suggested the brain had probably been given to someone from the office of Kennedy's brother, then Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, but he'd been dead since 1968. Succeeding investigations have come up empty.
It's a mystery wrapped in a riddle inside an enigma!
To this day, no one knows what happened to the missing evidence, and at this point, it seems likely that we'll never know. JFK's presidency was defined by seismic events like the Cuban Missile Crisis and conflict with the Soviet Union, so it makes sense that he would have been working hand in hand with the CIA. You know, those guys who were supposed to be working to protect the U.S. from international threats? The first CIA chief under Kennedy was Allen Dulles, a staunch defender of the agency.
The idea that it is necessarily nefarious, it's always engaged in overthrowing governments, that's false. That's for the birds.
The accepted story is that Kennedy and the CIA were at odds over a lot of things, but actual concrete evidence is tricky to find. The truth about JFK's relationship with the agency has long walked the line between conspiracy theory and tragic fact. In the 2025 document dump, there's one that claims the president was in fact targeted by a group from within his own government. The accusation comes from a memo regarding a CIA agent referred to as Gary Underhill and identified as John Garrett Underhill Jr. The general idea is that Underhill claimed Kennedy had found out about something, probably connected to the drugs or gun trade going on in the CIA, and that he was murdered to keep it quiet. Sound unlikely? The documents also reveal that shortly after Underhill made his statements, he was found dead. The official ruling was that he died by suicide, but it's pretty clear from the memo that no one actually believed that. Think that's a massive coincidence? The truth is, we don't know the truth. But what's more tragic in the end? A beloved president murdered by a lone assassin or by his own government? We tend to focus on Jackie and the kids Kennedy left behind, but it's worth remembering that he was the third child his mother Rose had lost. Joe Jr. died during World War II, and her daughter Kathleen, known as Kick, was killed in 1948. She married British soldier William Billy Cavendish, Lord Hartington, in 1944. But Cavendish was killed in action in Belgium just weeks after their wedding. 4 years later, 28-year-old Kick and her married lover, the 8th Earl Fitzwilliam, were killed in a plane crash in France.
Jack Kennedy is a man who doesn't cry, who rarely shows emotions, but that day, Jack Kennedy breaks down.
In 1973, Rose spoke with the BBC about the moment she learned Jack had also been killed. She recalled, "I'm an optimist. When I first heard it, I thought maybe it was just an accident or a slight sort of thing. But then Bobby telephoned and said it was serious, and then events moved very quickly." Rose likened the Kennedy family story to the agony and ecstasy of Michelangelo, saying, "We've had these ecstatic moments and these tragic ones. And JFK's death wasn't the last tragedy in Rose's life by far. She'd lose Bobby to an assassin's bullet in 1968, but Rose was a survivor. She died in 1995 at 104 years old." When it comes to high-profile figures like presidents, tragedy doesn't stop with the immediate family. There have been a number of thought experiments conducted on just how different our world would be today had Kennedy not been shot, and it's pretty heartbreaking stuff. For starters, there's the Vietnam War. The U.S. began withdrawal from the region in 1973, and official numbers suggest that 58,200 Americans died, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese who were killed in the conflict. Had Kennedy survived, that number may have been much lower, as he was already laying the groundwork for American withdrawal more than 10 years prior to when it finally happened.
The spear point of aggression has been blunted in South Vietnam.
Kennedy's survival might have also meant that the domestic conflict and protests that defined the Vietnam era wouldn't have happened either. What would that mean for us, and what would that mean for Vietnam? It's impossible to know, but it's a fascinating idea to think about. There's obviously a lot of guesswork at play here. Still, some historians and writers suggest that Kennedy would have been able to fast-track nuclear disarmament, and the relationship between the Soviet Union and the US could have played out very differently. It's not all rainbows and roses, though, as a second Kennedy term was far from guaranteed. If Kennedy had been shot but survived, there's a possibility that the shadier parts of his story, like his mafia connections and womanizing, would have become public pretty quickly. In the opinion of Kennedy's grandson, Jack Schlossberg, the greatest tragedy of Kennedy's life is that he's more remembered for the way he died than the legacy he left behind. He has a compelling point. When it was announced that documents relating to the assassination were going to be released in 2025, Schlossberg took to social media to condemn the move.
"There's so much actual news going on. Why are you covering this?"
Not only did he say that the family had no say or warning of the release, but he also took offense to a post on X from Republican Senator Mike Lee of Utah, who asked, "Why did it take so long to release the JFK files?" Schlossberg wasn't having it. He fired back, "You really care about JFK's legacy? You're dismantling it." Schlossberg pointed out that not only was the current administration obsessing over Kennedy's death in a super weird way that disrespected the family, but at the same time, it was making massive cuts to programs like the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, which Kennedy established, rendering the organization obsolete. In a 2017 piece published in Time magazine, Schlossberg condemned the fact that his grandfather's death was being used to distract from real issues like climate change and systemic racism, while the first Trump administration tried to take health care away from millions of American citizens.
That the Constitution will be colorblind, as Justice Harlan said at the turn of the century.
He concluded, "For decades, conspiracies surrounding my grandfather's death have shifted focus away from the important lessons of his life and the critical issues of the moment. They continue to do so today."